What if the greatest threat to a tank crew wasn't the enemy outside, but the machine they were sealed inside? Why does the T-72 tank have a reputation as a death sentence on wheels, and why do its turrets fly dozens of meters into the air when hit? How did a design intended to revolutionize armored warfare end up trapping crews in a metal coffin that could explode at any moment? You're about to hear the disturbing story of the T-72, the tank that killed more of its own crews than it saved, and turned what should have been a fortress into a ticking time bomb. The story begins in the early 1960s, when the Soviet Union stood at a crossroads in tank design. The Cold War was heating up, and Soviet military planners knew they needed a new main battle tank that could be produced in massive numbers, operated by conscripts with minimal training, and stand up to NATO armor on the battlefields of a potential World War III. What they created would become one of the most widely produced tanks in history, with over 25,000 units built and countless more variants produced across the globe. But hidden beneath its sloped armor and powerful gun was a design flaw so fundamental, so catastrophic, that it would doom thousands of men to fiery deaths in the decades to come. The T-72 emerged from Soviet tank design bureaus in 1968, and at first glance, it seemed like a masterpiece of engineering efficiency. The designers at Uralvagonzavod in Nizhny Tagil had been tasked with creating a tank that could be manufactured cheaply, maintained easily, and operated by soldiers with limited technical training. Remember, the Soviet military relied heavily on conscripts who served only 2 years, so complexity was the enemy. The tank featured several innovations that made it stand out. It had a relatively small profile, making it harder to hit on the battlefield. Its 125mm smoothbore gun was one of the most powerful tank weapons in the world when it first appeared, capable of firing both conventional shells and guided missiles. The frontal armor was well sloped and thick enough to deflect many contemporary anti-tank weapons. And the T-72 was fast, agile, and could operate in extreme conditions from Arctic cold to desert heat. But the feature that Soviet designers were most proud of was the automatic loading system. Unlike Western tanks that required a human loader as the fourth crew member, the T-72 used a mechanical autoloader that could feed shells into the gun at a consistent rate. This ingenious carousel mechanism sat at the base of the turret, holding 22 to 28 rounds in a circular arrangement. When the gunner selected a shell type, the carousel would rotate to the correct position, and a mechanical arm would grab the projectile and ram it into the gun's breech. This automation meant the T-72 only needed a crew of 3 instead of 4. The commander, gunner, and driver could operate the entire tank without the physically demanding job of manually loading heavy shells in the cramped, sweltering interior. It made the tank smaller, lighter, and theoretically more efficient. Soviet planners celebrated this as a triumph of socialist engineering over capitalist wastefulness. However, what looked brilliant on paper concealed a nightmare waiting to happen. Because to make that autoloader work, the designers had made a choice that would haunt every man who ever climbed inside a T-72. They had placed the ammunition directly beneath the crew, in the most vulnerable position imaginable. Let's talk about what happens inside a T-72 when it gets hit. In Western tanks like the American M1 Abrams or the British Challenger, ammunition is stored in a separate compartment at the rear of the turret, behind armored doors and protected by blowout panels. If that ammunition gets hit and catches fire, the explosion vents upward and outward, away from the crew. The compartment is sealed off, and while the tank might be destroyed, the crew has a fighting chance to escape. The T-72 has no such protection. Every single round in that carousel sits directly under the turret ring, surrounded by the crew. The shells are arranged in a circle, warheads pointing inward, propellant charges exposed. When you're sitting in a T-72, you're essentially perched on top of a ring of high explosives, with nothing but a thin metal floor between you and catastrophe. Now here's where it gets even worse. The autoloader could only hold about 22 to 28 rounds, depending on the variant. Soviet doctrine called for tanks to carry more ammunition than that, usually around 40 to 45 rounds total. So where did the extra ammunition go? It was stuffed anywhere there was space. Behind the turret. under the seats, in bins along the walls. Basically, the crew compartment became a magazine, packed with loose shells and propellant charges scattered throughout the fighting space. These loose rounds weren't protected by anything. They weren't in armored containers. They weren't separated from the crew. They were just there, sitting next to the men, waiting. Tank crews even took to stacking extra shells wherever they could fit them, knowing they might need the ammunition in extended combat. But every extra round they brought aboard increased the chances that a single hit would kill them all. Military analysts have a term for what happens next. They call it the jack-in-the-box effect. And it's exactly as horrifying as it sounds. When an anti-tank weapon penetrates a T-72's armor, whether it's a missile, a sabot round, or even a rocket-propelled grenade hitting a weak spot, it sends a jet of superheated metal and explosive energy into the crew compartment. That jet, traveling at thousands of meters per second, instantly ignites anything flammable it touches. And inside a T-72, almost everything is flammable. The loose ammunition catches fire first. The propellant charges, which contain highly combustible material, start to burn. Within seconds, the temperature inside the crew compartment skyrockets. The fire spreads to other shells. The crew, if they're still alive at this point, have maybe 2 or 3 seconds to react before physics takes over. As more ammunition cooks off, pressure builds rapidly inside the sealed turret. The hatches are closed in combat, remember, because opening them would expose the crew to small arms fire and shrapnel. But now those closed hatches become part of the death trap. The pressure keeps building. 1,000 pounds per square inch. 2,000. 3,000. The ammunition in the autoloader carousel, heated by the fire above, reaches its ignition point. When that carousel explodes, the force has to go somewhere. And the weakest point in the entire structure is the turret ring, the circular joint where the turret meets the hull. The explosion finds that weakness and exploits it. In a fraction of a second, the turret, weighing more than 12 tons, is blown completely off the tank. It launches into the air like a rocket, sometimes flying 20, 30, even 50 meters high before crashing back to Earth. The crew inside doesn't survive. The explosion is so violent, so immediate, that death comes before they even know what's happening. But here's the truly horrific part. Sometimes, when the autoloader ignites, the crew is still alive from the initial hit. They're wounded, burned, trying to escape. And then the ammunition below them detonates, and they're incinerated in a fireball that reaches temperatures hot enough to melt steel. Battlefield footage from conflicts where T-72s have been used shows this effect with disturbing clarity. In Syria, in Chechnya, in Iraq, and most recently in Ukraine, videos show T-72s being hit, followed by a massive explosion that sends the turret spinning through the air. Sometimes the turret lands upside down dozens of meters away. Sometimes it crashes through buildings. Sometimes it just disintegrates in the blast. Western military analysts who studied these catastrophic kills came to a grim conclusion. When a T-72 is penetrated in the crew compartment, survival is almost impossible. The crew has virtually no chance of escaping before the ammunition cooks off. Now you might be thinking, well, if you don't get hit, you don't have to worry about the ammunition exploding. And that's true. But the problem is, the T-72 has several critical vulnerabilities that make it far easier to hit in exactly the wrong places. Let's start with the most notorious. The top armor. While the T-72's frontal armor is thick and well-sloped, the armor on top of the turret and hull is shockingly thin. In most variants, the roof armor is only 30 to 45 mm thick. That's enough to stop small arms fire and shell fragments, but it's completely inadequate against modern anti-tank weapons. This became a critical problem with the introduction of top-attack munitions. Weapons like the American Javelin missile and various loitering munitions don't try to punch through the thick frontal armor. They fly high, then dive down at a steep angle, striking the tank from above where the armor is weakest. When a javelin hits the thin roof of a T-72, it punches through like a knife through paper, and the shape-charged jet goes straight down into the crew compartment. You can imagine what happens next. In the current conflict in Ukraine, This vulnerability has been exploited ruthlessly. Ukrainian forces equipped with javelins have destroyed hundreds of Russian T-72s by attacking from above. Drone operators have also learned to drop modified anti-tank grenades directly onto the turret roofs of T-72s, with devastating results. The tank that was designed to withstand frontal assaults against NATO armor in the plains of Europe never accounted for the threat coming from directly overhead. But the top isn't the only weak spot. The sides and rear of the T-72 are also vulnerable. While the frontal armor can be anywhere from 200 to 400 mm thick depending on the variant and whether it has reactive armor, the side armor is only 70 to 80 mm in most places. That's thick enough to stop older anti-tank weapons, but modern rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank missiles can punch through it with ease. Soviet designers knew about this vulnerability, and they tried to address it by adding reactive armor tiles, known as contact, to the sides of upgraded T-72s. These tiles are designed to explode outward when hit, disrupting the shape-charged jet of incoming missiles before they can penetrate the main armor. In theory, it's a clever solution. In practice, the coverage is incomplete, leaving gaps that trained anti-tank gunners can exploit. Ukrainian forces have been trained to aim for these gaps. They know exactly where the reactive armor doesn't cover. They know where to hit to penetrate the side armor and reach the crew compartment or, even better, the ammunition storage. Intelligence reports suggest that Ukrainian anti-tank teams have developed detailed targeting guides showing the exact weak points on every Russian tank variant, including the T-72B3, the most common version deployed in the current conflict. Then there's another, almost comical weakness that makes the T-72 especially vulnerable in combat: the reverse gear. Or rather, the lack of an effective one. Most modern tanks can reverse almost as fast as they can move forward. This allows them to use what's called a hull-down position, where the tank sits behind a ridge or hill with only the turret exposed. If the crew spots an enemy, they can engage, and if things get dangerous, they can quickly reverse back behind cover. It's a fundamental tactic of modern armored warfare. The T-72 can't do this. Its maximum reverse speed is about 4 km per hour, roughly the speed of a slow walk. If a T-72 crew finds themselves in danger and needs to retreat quickly, they can't just back up. They have to turn the entire tank around, exposing their thin side and rear armor to enemy fire. It's a design flaw that has gotten countless crews killed, because by the time they've turned around to retreat, they've already been hit. Imagine being a T-72 driver in combat. You've just spotted an enemy anti-tank position. Your commander orders you to back up and find cover. You throw the tank into reverse, but you're crawling backward at walking speed while enemy gunners are lining up their shots. Every second feels like an eternity. You can hear your commander screaming at you to go faster, but the tank won't move any quicker. And then you hear the worst sound in the world, the metallic scream of an incoming round. This flaw has been documented repeatedly in combat. In one particularly tragic incident during the current conflict, a Russian T-72B3 was filmed attempting to reverse out of a position after coming under fire. The tank moved so slowly that Ukrainian forces had ample time to fire multiple anti-tank missiles at it. The first hit disabled the track. The second penetrated the hull. The third set off the ammunition, and the turret launched into the sky. Soviet and later Russian tank crews knew about these flaws. They weren't stupid. They understood that their tanks had fundamental weaknesses that Western tanks didn't have. And over the decades, they developed various desperate measures to try to improve their chances of survival. One of the most common field modifications was adding extra armor. Crews would weld steel plates to the sides and front of their tanks, hoping to add a few extra millimeters of protection. Some would attach spare track links to the hull, creating a crude form of spaced armor. Others would pile sandbags on top of the turret and hull, trying to provide some protection against top attack weapons. A few particularly desperate crews even tried coating their tanks in concrete, which added weight and reduced mobility but gave them a psychological sense of protection. But these improvised armor modifications rarely made much difference. The extra weight slowed the tank down and increased fuel consumption, which was a serious problem for vehicles that already had limited range. And when anti-tank weapons hit, the improvised armor usually didn't stop them. At best, it might deflect a glancing blow. At worst, it gave crews false confidence that got them killed. Some of the more recent attempts to address the top attack vulnerability have been almost comical in their desperation. In Ukraine, Russian tank crews have been observed welding metal cages on top of their turrets, creating structures that soldiers and analysts have nicknamed cope cages. The idea is that top attack munitions will detonate against the cage before reaching the turret roof, dissipating the explosive force. In practice, these cope cages are largely ineffective. Modern anti-tank warheads are designed to detonate at an optimal standoff distance anyway, so the cage doesn't really change much. And the added weight and bulk makes the turret harder to traverse and increases the tank's profile, making it easier to spot. But crews keep adding them because doing something feels better than doing nothing, even when that something doesn't actually help. The ammunition problem has no field solution at all. Some crews try to reduce the amount of ammunition they carry, operating with only the rounds in the autoloader and a few extra shells, reasoning that less ammunition means less chance of a catastrophic explosion. But this limits their combat effectiveness and leaves them vulnerable in extended engagements. Other crews accept the risk and pack in as much ammunition as possible, gambling that they'll be able to destroy the enemy before the enemy destroys them. It's a terrible choice either way. Carry less ammunition and you might run out in the middle of a battle. Carry more and you increase the chances that one hit will kill your entire crew. There's no good option, because the fundamental design of the tank makes survival nearly impossible once the armor is breached. Now let's talk about what this means for the men who have to fight in these machines. Because ultimately, this isn't just a story about engineering flaws and design compromises. It's a story about human beings who are sent into combat in vehicles that are statistically likely to kill them if hit. Consider the psychological impact of knowing you're sitting on top of a carousel of high explosives. Every T-72 crew member knows about the jack-in-the-box effect. They've seen the videos. They've heard the stories. They know that if their tank is penetrated, they probably won't have time to escape. That knowledge creates a constant, grinding stress that affects performance and decision-making. Some crews develop a fatalistic attitude. They figure that if their number's up, it's up, and there's nothing they can do about it. Others become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats, jumping at every sound, exhausting themselves mentally before the battle even begins. Still others simply try not to think about it, which is easier said than done when you're sealed inside a metal box that could explode at any moment. The casualty statistics tell a grim story. In the current conflict in Ukraine, Russia has lost over 3,500 tanks according to open-source intelligence, and a significant portion of these are T-72 variants. Video evidence shows that the vast majority of these lost tanks suffered catastrophic kills, with the characteristic turret toss indicating ammunition detonation. This means that most of the crews died instantly, with little to no chance of survival. Compare this to Western tank crews. During World War II, American tank crews had a survival rate of around 80%, even though their Sherman tanks were vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. British crews had slightly lower survival rates, but still around 70 to 80%. These crews operated tanks with ammunition stored in vulnerable positions too, but the vehicles were designed with escape hatches, and the combat environment allowed for crew evacuation in many cases. Modern Western tanks have pushed crew survivability even higher. The M1 Abrams, for example, has been in service for over 40 years and has been hit by countless anti-tank weapons in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts. Yet crew fatalities remain relatively rare because the ammunition is stored separately and the tank is designed to protect its occupants even when catastrophically damaged. Tank crews in an Abrams know that if they are hit, they have a reasonable chance of survival. T-72 crews don't have that assurance. When they button up the hatches and roll into combat, they know they're taking an enormous risk. And not just from enemy action. The tank itself is a threat to their survival. The T-72's vulnerabilities have been exploited more ruthlessly in recent conflicts than ever before, because the nature of anti-tank warfare has evolved dramatically. In the Cold War era, when the T-72 was designed, the primary anti-tank threat was other tanks firing kinetic energy penetrators or shaped charge warheads. Tank-on-tank battles were expected to occur at ranges of 1,000 to 2,000 meters, with relatively flat trajectories. The T-72's sloped frontal armor was designed for this threat environment. But modern anti-tank weapons operate completely differently. Portable missiles like the Javelin, NLAW, and TOW can be fired from hidden positions by infantry teams. They can strike from unexpected angles. And increasingly, they can attack from above, where the T-72 is most vulnerable. The proliferation of drones has made things even worse. Small commercial quadcopters modified to drop anti-tank grenades or RPG warheads have become a serious threat on modern battlefields. These drones can hover over a tank, find the exact weak spot on the turret roof, and drop a munition with precision. The crew inside often doesn't even know they're being targeted until the explosion tears through the roof. In Ukraine, both sides have used these drone tactics extensively, but the T-72 is especially vulnerable due to its thin top armor and ammunition placement. Ukrainian forces have released videos showing drones dropping munitions directly onto Russian T-72s, followed by the characteristic massive explosion as the ammunition cooks off. It's a terrifying development for tank crews, because it means they can be killed from an angle they can't defend against and often can't even see. Loitering munitions, sometimes called kamikaze drones, pose an even greater threat. Systems like the Switchblade 300 and 600 are designed specifically for top attack strikes against armored vehicles. They orbit over the battlefield, identify targets, and dive down at high speed, punching through roof armor before the crew can react. These weapons were specifically designed to exploit the weaknesses of Soviet-era tanks like the T-72. The T-72 also struggles in urban combat, which has become increasingly common in modern warfare. Cities and towns are full of ambush positions where infantry can attack tanks from the sides and rear. The limited situational awareness in a T-72, with its relatively small vision blocks and lack of effective modern optics in many variants, means crews often don't see threats until it's too late. Russian T-72B3s in Ukraine have been repeatedly ambushed in urban areas. Ukrainian anti-tank teams hide in buildings, wait for the tanks to pass by, and then fire at the vulnerable side armor. By the time the tank crew realizes they are under attack, the missile is already in flight. And because of the slow reverse speed, even if the crew tries to retreat, they usually can't escape in time. Modern thermal imaging and night vision systems have also tilted the battlefield against the T-72. Many T-72 variants, especially the older models and even some of the upgraded B3 versions, lack effective thermal sights. This means they're essentially blind at night or in poor visibility conditions. Enemy forces with thermal imaging can spot T-72s and engage them from positions where the T-72 crews can't effectively return fire. There are reports from Ukraine of Russian T-72 crews relying on consumer GPS devices for navigation and having to open their hatches periodically to maintain situational awareness. This is a dangerous practice in combat, as it exposes the crew to snipers and small arms fire, but the alternative is driving blind through potentially hostile territory. All of these factors combine to make the T-72 increasingly obsolete on the modern battlefield. It was designed for a different kind of war, against different threats, using different tactics. But that obsolescence doesn't matter to military planners who keep sending crews out in these vehicles. So why do militaries continue to use the T-72 despite all these known flaws? The answer comes down to brutal practicality. Russia and the nations that operate T-72s have thousands of these tanks in storage. Replacing them with modern designs would cost hundreds of billions of dollars that many of these countries don't have. So instead, they try to upgrade them, adding modern fire control systems, better armor, and improved engines. But no amount of upgrades can fix the fundamental design flaws. You can't move the ammunition carousel without completely redesigning the entire tank. You can't add effective blowout panels without ripping out the autoloader and reconfiguring the turret. You can't significantly improve the reverse speed without replacing the transmission. At a certain point, you're not upgrading a T-72 anymore, you're building a completely new tank. The T-90, Russia's supposed next-generation main battle tank, is really just a heavily upgraded T-72 with better electronics and armor. It still has the same fundamental ammunition storage problem. It still has the carousel of death beneath the crew. Some later variants incorporate minor improvements like armored fuel tanks and slightly better separation of ammunition, but the basic vulnerability remains. This has created a situation where tank crews are essentially expendable in military planning. The human cost is accepted as unavoidable. When a T-72 is lost in combat, the assumption is that the crew is lost too. There's no expectation of survival. The tank isn't designed to protect its occupants, it's designed to be a relatively cheap, easy-to-produce weapons platform that can be fielded in large numbers. Consider the implications of that philosophy. Western militaries spend enormous amounts of money on crew survivability because they believe that trained tank crews are valuable assets worth protecting. The equipment can be replaced, but experienced crews represent years of training and combat knowledge. Losing crews means losing institutional knowledge and combat effectiveness. Soviet and Russian military doctrine has historically taken a different approach. Tanks are built in large numbers with the expectation that many will be lost in combat. Crews are conscripts who can be trained relatively quickly and replaced when necessary. The focus is on quantity over quality, on overwhelming the enemy with numbers rather than technological superiority. In this calculus, individual crew survivability is less important than fielding enough tanks to achieve strategic objectives. But this philosophy has a dark side. It means that young men, often conscripts who have no choice about their service, are placed in vehicles that are fundamentally unsafe. They're told to climb into a machine that's likely to kill them if it's hit, and they're sent into combat with the knowledge that their survival is not a priority for the people giving orders. The recent conflict in Ukraine has brought this reality into stark focus. Intercepted communications from Russian tank crews reveal a mixture of fatalism, fear, and resignation. They know what they're up against. They know their tanks are vulnerable. They know that many of them won't come home. But they have no choice except to follow orders and hope they're lucky. The numbers are staggering. As of late 2024, open-source intelligence suggests Russia has lost over 3,500 tanks in Ukraine, with losses continuing daily. If we conservatively estimate that each tank had a crew of 3, and that the majority of catastrophically destroyed tanks had no survivors, we're looking at potentially 10,000 or more tank crewmen killed. That's an entire generation of trained armor personnel, gone. And for what? The T-72 has proven incapable of achieving the goals it was designed for. It can't survive on the modern battlefield. Its weapons can't effectively engage targets in the environments where contemporary combat occurs. Its armor can't protect against the threats it faces. The tank has become a death trap that serves no real military purpose except to send crews to their deaths. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the T-72 story is that these flaws were known from the very beginning. Soviet engineers understood the risks of placing ammunition beneath the crew. They knew that a penetrating hit would likely cause a catastrophic explosion. But they made a calculated decision that the benefits of the autoloader and reduced crew size outweighed the dangers. In the 1970s and 1980s, when the T-72 first entered service, this calculation might have seemed reasonable. Anti-tank weapons were less sophisticated. Top attack munitions didn't exist. Thermal imaging was in its infancy. The threats that make the T-72 so vulnerable today were not present in the environment it was designed for. But as those threats emerged and evolved, the fundamental design was not reconsidered. Upgrades were made around the edges, new variants were produced, but the core flaw remained. And crews continued to die because of it. This represents a failure not just of engineering, but of military doctrine and institutional culture. Western militaries observed the T-72's vulnerabilities in conflict after conflict. They saw catastrophic kills in the Gulf War, in Chechnya, in Syria. They understood what was causing the problem, and they made sure their own tank designs avoided the same mistakes. The M1 Abrams was specifically designed with crew survivability as a primary consideration. The ammunition is stored in a separate compartment with blowout panels. The armor is arranged to protect the crew first. The vehicle's systems are designed to give crews the best possible chance of surviving a hit and escaping the vehicle. This philosophy has saved countless lives over the decades. But in Russia and other countries operating Soviet-designed tanks, the lesson was never learned. Or perhaps it was learned but ignored because of the enormous cost of replacing existing inventory. Either way, the result is the same: crews continue to die in tanks that are designed to kill them. There's a grim irony in the name T-72. In Russian military terminology, the T stands for tank and the number indicates the year design work began. So the T-72 represents 1972 technology, thinking, and design philosophy. It's a Cold War relic being used in 21st century conflicts against 21st century weapons. The crews might as well be fighting in museum pieces. And yet, the T-72 will likely continue to see combat for decades to come. Russia still has thousands in storage. Other countries, including India, Syria, and various nations that can't afford modern tanks, continue to operate them. The tank that betrayed its crew will continue betraying crews for the foreseeable future. The next time you watch a turret spiraling skyward after a T-72 explosion, remember, inside that blast were real people, betrayed by the very armor built to save them. These tanks didn't just fail, they turned into cages of fire, sealing fates long before battle began. It's a chilling warning about the price of technical compromise, and how a machine meant to protect can, in the end, become a soldier's gravestone.